"Arrest him," my mother-in-law screamed at the military ball, until the MPs ran my ID and every officer in the room stood up. She grabbed the military police officer by the arm in the middle of a ballroom full of admirals, and I watched her do it from 30 feet away without moving a single muscle. I had just walked back in from the officer's suite in my dress whites, 14 years of service on my shoulders, the rank boards of a Navy captain, every ribbon I had ever earned above my left breast pocket, and there were enough of them that new officers sometimes stopped mid-sentence to count. My mother-in-law, Patricia Weston, 67 years old, Greenwich, Connecticut, had never once in 6 years of marriage asked me what any of them meant. She pointed at me across the ballroom with the absolute conviction of a woman who had decided, somewhere between cocktail hour and the dinner seating, that the man her daughter had married was wearing a costume. "That man," she said, loud enough for the nearest cluster of officers and spouses to turn their heads. "He doesn't belong here. I want him removed. He's impersonating an officer." The MP she had grabbed was Corporal Daniel Reyes, 23 years old, United States Army, assigned to the Joint Service Security Detail for the evening. He had been standing at parade rest by the entrance, doing his job. He looked at Patricia. He looked across the room at me. He did his job. He walked toward me the length of the entire ballroom. Every person between us watched him do it. I stood still. My hands were relaxed at my sides. My jaw was loose. I had spent 14 years learning how to hold myself in moments of pressure, how to let the storm move through without letting it take anything with it. I was not afraid. I was not humiliated. I was watching something complete itself. My father was a high school history teacher in Annapolis, Maryland, who spent his summers rebuilding boat engines in the garage. He was not a military man. He wore flannel shirts and made terrible coffee, and had the particular patience of someone who understood that most things worth knowing take a long time to learn. He was also the most quietly certain person I have ever met. He used to say that the only thing that separated a man who knew what he was worth from a man who didn't was whether he'd ever done something genuinely hard. Not hard in the way that sounds impressive at dinner parties. Hard in the way that leaves you changed. The kind of hard that strips away everything ornamental and shows you what you're actually made of underneath. I was 17 when I decided I wanted to go to Annapolis, not the Naval Academy, the city. I had grown up watching the midshipmen run in formation along the waterfront in the early mornings, and something about the discipline of it, the seriousness of it, the sense that these were people who had agreed to hold themselves to a standard the rest of the world did not require of them. It got into me early and never left. My father drove me to the Academy's information session on a Saturday in November. He didn't say much on the drive, he just drove. On the way home, he said, "If you're going to do this, do it all the way. Don't leave anything on the table." I didn't. I entered the United States Naval Academy in August of 2003. I was 18, from a working-class family in a Navy town, which meant I understood the structure but had never lived inside it. Plebe summer was the first genuinely hard thing I had ever done. Not the hardest thing, that was coming, but the first thing that required me to discover, in real time, whether I was actually the person I believed myself to be. I was smaller than some of my cohort, quieter than most. I did not make my presence known by volume. I made it known by showing up better prepared than everyone around me, every single day, without exception, for 4 years. I graduated in May of 2007. My father stood in the crowd in a sport coat he had borrowed from his brother. He did not cry. He shook my hand at the commissioning ceremony, held it for a moment longer than necessary, and said, "Now you know." I did. Intelligence work found me the way the right work usually finds people, by being the thing you're specifically built for that you didn't know existed until you were already doing it. My first assignment, Pacific Fleet, 2007. I was 22 years old and operating in a world where the information I handled carried consequences I was never permitted to discuss in any detail outside my chain of command. I made peace with that early. The work mattered whether or not anyone knew about it. That was the point. I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade in 2010, lieutenant in 2012. By 2013, I was 28 years old, a lieutenant commander running more operational responsibility than my rank officially indicated, and on an accelerated track that my commanding officer, Captain Richard Oleska, 48 years old and 22 years in naval intelligence, described in my performance review as unusual and worth protecting. I have kept that review. I know exactly where it is. By 2016, I was a commander, 05, leading an intelligence cell inside a joint task force with a clearance designation that appears on very few identification cards. The kind of clearance that triggers an elevated verification protocol when the card is scanned, a detail I stored in the back of my mind without particular sentiment, the way you remember where you keep the fire extinguisher. The point is, by the time I walked into that ballroom in my dress whites, 14 years of work had accumulated on my shoulders into something visible and specific and unmistakable to anyone trained to read it. My mother-in-law was not trained to read it. She had decided, at some point in the 6 years before that evening, that she didn't need to be. I met Claire Weston in 2016 at a charity auction in San Diego, the kind of event that neither of us would have attended without being dragged there by mutual obligations. She was there with a friend from her firm. She was a structural engineer, brilliant brilliant in the particular way that people are brilliant when their intelligence is applied to things that actually have to work. She spent 45 minutes at the auction explaining to me, unprompted, why a building's response to lateral force was more interesting than its response to vertical load. I had never given this topic any prior thought. By the end of the conversation, I had opinions about it. She asked what I did. I told her. She did not perform the standard civilian response to military service, which tends to oscillate between performative reverence and polite incomprehension. She asked a specific follow-up question about intelligence coordination in joint command environments. I asked where she had learned enough to ask that question. She said, "My uncle was a Marine colonel. He talked about joint ops constantly. I mostly just listened." "I mostly just listened" was the thing she said that told me everything I needed to know about her. We were engaged by the end of 2017, married in March of 2018. A ceremony on base, small, exact, surrounded by people who understood where we were without needing it explained to them. My father sat in the front row in his borrowed sport coat and looked at Claire with the focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. Afterward, he said, "She's the real thing, James. Don't waste it." I had no intention of wasting it. Patricia Weston, Claire's mother, stood at the reception and received me with warmth that lasted the length of the evening. I remember thinking it was a good beginning. I was wrong about what it was. The first sign arrived within the month. Patricia called Claire on a Sunday. They spoke every Sunday, a rhythm that had been established long before I arrived and showed no signs of restructuring around the new marriage. And I happened to be in the kitchen when Claire came in afterward. Her face had the particular neutrality she put on when she was deciding whether to tell me something. She told me. Patricia had asked whether I planned to leave the military now that we were married. The word she had used was realistic, whether I was being realistic about career longevity, whether I had thought about something more stable. I was 33 years old with 11 years of service and a classified operational portfolio inside a joint task force. I was not unstable. I told Claire it was fine. She said she knew it wasn't. We left it at that. The second sign was less ambiguous. A family dinner at Patricia's home in Greenwich, 4 months into the marriage. Her house was a specific kind of immaculate, the immaculate of a woman who has spent her entire life ensuring that every visible surface communicates exactly the message she intends it to communicate. Good furniture, careful art, rooms that had been arranged to suggest a particular kind of authority without announcing it. We sat down for dinner. There were 8 people at the table, including Claire's older brother, Garrett Weston, 42, a commercial real estate developer, and his wife. The conversation moved through family updates and then, as it always does in rooms like that, arrived at the question of work. Patricia looked at me across the table and said, with the earnest curiosity of someone asking about a hobby, "And James, what is it you actually do in the Navy?" Claire tells us things, but they never quite make sense, I explained in terms appropriate for a civilian dinner table. Intelligence analysis, joint task force coordination, the kind of work that supports operational decisions across multiple commands. Patricia listened with the expression of someone following a foreign language film without subtitles. When I finished, she turned to Garrett and said, "So more of a staff role, really?" Garrett nodded. I looked at my plate for a moment. Claire put her hand on my knee under the table. I said nothing. Not because I had surrendered, but because I was watching something clarify itself, and interrupting the process seemed like a waste of the information it was producing. Patricia was not confused about what I did. She had made a decision about what I was, and the decision had preceded meeting me and would likely survive any amount of correction. I was the man who had married her daughter and taken Claire into a world Patricia did not understand and had never bothered to try. That was the real complaint. The Navy was just the surface of it. The pattern established itself over the next 5 years with the quiet persistence of weather. Patricia's disapproval was never loud. It was architectural, load-bearing in a specific way that made it impossible to address without appearing to create the very conflict she was allegedly not starting. She asked Claire at a summer gathering in 2019 whether I had given any thought to career counseling. For the transition, she said. The transition that was, at that point, more than a decade away at minimum, if it ever came at all. She referred to me at a family reunion as Claire's Navy husband. Not my name, not my rank. Claire's Navy husband, delivered with the slightly apologetic intonation of someone acknowledging a lifestyle choice they find puzzling but are trying to be gracious about. She told her book club, and one of the members mentioned this to Claire at a neighborhood event, that she worried Claire had limited herself by marrying someone whose career would always come first. The career in question was the one she had also described as a staff role. I absorbed these things without making them the subject of our marriage. That was a choice I made deliberately, because Claire had been placed in the center of this without asking to be, and I had no interest in putting her in the position of choosing between her mother's approval and her husband's grievances. But the cost of that choice accumulated quietly, the way costs do when you defer them long enough. By 2021, I had been promoted to Captain 06, Senior Field Officer, equivalent to a full colonel in the Army, the designation that carries, when the identification card is scanned at a joint service event, the elevated verification protocol I mentioned earlier. I told Claire over dinner the night the orders arrived. She put her hand over mine line and said, "I knew before you did." I asked how. She said, "Because I know what your work looks like and I've been watching it for 4 years." I looked at her across the table and understood for the first time that whatever the cost of the previous 4 years had been, this was the dividend. I called my father the same evening. He was quiet for a moment after I told him, and then he said, "Now do something worth the rank." That was the only thing he ever needed to say. In early 2022, Patricia came to visit for a weekend. Claire had suggested it. The kind of optimism my wife is capable of that I have always admired even when it produces outcomes she did not anticipate. The visit was 3 days. On the second evening, we attended a neighborhood dinner at a colleague's home. Several of my fellow officers were present, including Commander Teresa Wall, 44 years old, and one of the most decorated intelligence officers currently serving in the Pacific Fleet. Teresa addressed me by rank when she greeted me. Natural, automatic, the choreography of people who understand hierarchy as structure rather than performance. Patricia watched the exchange. On the drive home, she said, "I never understand why they all have to do the rank thing. It seems so unnecessary." Claire said carefully, "Mom, it's how the military works. It's not ceremony, it's how they communicate." Patricia said, "It just seems a bit much for a dinner party." I looked at the road. I did not say what I was thinking, which was, it was a dinner party hosted by a rear admiral, and the rank thing was less ornamental than the Wedgwood china. I said nothing. Claire reached over and touched my hand briefly. The gesture was so small and so accurate that it almost undid me. In January of 2026, Claire told me her mother had asked whether she might attend the annual military ball at Naval Station Norfolk as our guest. Joint service formal, flag officers, multiple commands represented. The kind of evening where the room itself communicates something about what 14 years of service actually looks like. I sat with that request for a moment. I thought about the 5 years of dinner tables and carefully delivered reductions, about the summer gathering and the career counseling, about Claire's hand on my knee and on the steering wheel and across the dinner table every time Patricia said something that required me to hold still. And then I said yes, not as a trap, not as a setup, as a decision made by a man who had finished managing the gap between who he was and who his mother-in-law believed him to be, and had arrived at a place of complete, settled willingness to let reality enter an open room and do its own work. I did not know what would happen. I simply knew I was done performing smallness to make a woman comfortable who had never once extended me the basic dignity of learning my rank. April of 2026. Naval Station, Norfolk. The ballroom was everything these events always are. Round tables with white linen, a head table, a podium for remarks, the warm light of a chandelier over people who have spent their lives earning the right to be in the same room together. I arrived with Claire during cocktail hour in civilian attire, standard practice. Officers change into dress whites for the ceremony portion later in the evening. Patricia arrived shortly after, in a midnight blue dress she had clearly selected with intention. Within the first 20 minutes, Rear Admiral Thomas Carver, 07, 56 years old, and the senior officer presiding over the Joint Service Coordination Committee I had been part of for the past 18 months, crossed the room to shake my hand. He addressed me by rank. He mentioned our last briefing. He asked about the intelligence coordination framework I had been developing. We spoke for 4 minutes. Patricia watched from Claire's elbow. When Carver departed, Patricia leaned toward Claire and said, just audible, "He seemed like an important man." Claire said, "He's a Rear Admiral, Mom." Patricia said, "And what does that mean in practical terms?" A commander standing nearby, Lieutenant Commander Alexis Park, 38 years old, 8 years in naval intelligence, someone I had served with during a Western Pacific deployment, answered without being asked, with the comfortable ease of someone stating an obvious fact. "It means he's a flag officer, ma'am. 2 stars. He outranks virtually everyone in this building, with the exception of the captain." She meant me. Patricia nodded. The information entered her face and left without a trace. I circulated through cocktail hour with the ease of someone for whom this particular room was home. I knew the protocols. I knew the ranks. I knew the specific choreography of how senior officers interact with each other at these events, who approaches whom, the calibrations of deference and familiarity, the shorthand of people who operate in the same professional ecosystem and understand each other's work without needing it translated. A Marine colonel shook my hand. A Navy commander I hadn't seen in 2 years clapped me on the shoulder. A visiting Army brigadier general and I had a brief, sharp conversation about a joint exercise we'd both been involved in from opposite sides of the command structure. Patricia stayed close to Claire, watching the difference between how people treated her daughter's husband at this event and how she had decided to treat him for 6 years accumulate in the air around her. She said to Claire under her breath, "Why does everyone keep coming over to talk to him?" Claire said, "Because he's one of the senior officers here, Mom." Patricia said, "Well, there's no need for all of it." Claire looked at her mother for a long moment. She did not respond. Approximately 90 minutes into cocktail hour, the ceremony portion began. Officers changed into dress whites. I excused myself to the officers' suite adjacent to the main hall. When I came back out, the visual effect of the uniform is something I have never fully been able to describe to someone who hasn't seen it. Not because it's spectacular in any theatrical sense, but because a full full complement of service awards and rank insignia on dress whites communicates something before you've said a word, something specific and heavy and earned in a room full of people who understand exactly what each element means. My dress whites carried 14 years, the boards of a Navy captain on each shoulder, the Eagle insignia of 06, 32 service ribbons above my left breast pocket, a classified commendation that every senior officer in that room recognized without needing it explained, the command designation of Joint Task Force 7, which carries a specific meaning in rooms like this one that most civilians have never encountered. I walked back toward the main hall. Officers near the entrance nodded as I passed. A commander stepped aside to let me through. A young ensign straightened almost imperceptibly. None of this was performed. The room was simply responding to what it saw. Patricia watched me walk in. I saw her face change, not a collapse, a decision. A woman who had spent 6 years constructing a specific story about who her daughter had married, looking at the man who had arrived at the end of that story, wearing the evidence that the story was wrong. She did not update the story. She doubled down on it. She said to Claire, her voice tight and low, "Who does he think he is walking in there like that? It looks ridiculous. He's showing off." Claire said very quietly, "Mom, that's his uniform. This is his event." Patricia had already turned. She was moving across the ballroom floor with the fixed purpose of a woman who has decided to resolve a situation that is, in reality, not a situation at all. She found Corporal Daniel Reyes, 23 years old, United States Army Military Police, posted at the ballroom entrance. She took his arm. I watched her do it from the other side of the room. I watched her mouth moving. I watched Reyes's face as he processed what she was saying, the specific professional stillness that military police develop, the trained non-reaction that contains everything while revealing nothing. I knew from 30 feet away exactly what was happening, and I stood still. "That man," Patricia said, loud enough for the dozen people immediately around her to hear every word, "is not what he's claiming to be. He doesn't belong here. I want him removed, arrested if necessary. He's impersonating an officer." The people who heard it went still. Not the whole room, not yet, but the cluster within earshot stopped mid-conversation and turned. Corporal Reyes looked at Patricia. He looked across the room at me. He walked the length of the ballroom. I watched him come. He reached me. He apologized for the interruption. Sincere, professional, without embarrassment. He explained that protocol required credential verification when a formal complaint was registered, regardless of circumstances. I looked at him for a moment. I did not look at Patricia. I did not look at the people who were now watching from every corner of the room. I reached into my uniform jacket and handed him my military identification card without a word. Reyes walked to the security podium near the entrance. The credential scanner used at joint service events at this clearance level. He inserted the card. The system processed. It returned my credentials in full. Captain James A. Mercer, United States Navy, Joint Task Force 7, Senior Command. Clearance level designated. The specific designation that triggers the elevated protocol. The kind that appears on very few cards and is immediately understood by anyone trained to read the screen. I watched Reyes's posture change. A small thing. A straightening. The automatic, trained physical response of a soldier who has just confirmed he is standing in front of someone who outranks virtually every person in the building. He looked up from the scanner. He looked at me across the ballroom. He took one breath. And then, in the voice they teach you at military police school for exactly this kind of moment, the voice built to carry over noise, over crowd, over the ambient sound of 200 people at a formal dinner, he called out, "Attention on deck." The room answered. Every uniformed officer present, Navy, Marine Corps, Army, Air Force, rose from their seats and stood at attention, simultaneously, without hesitation. Chairs pushed back across the floor. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were set on the table. The sound was not a sound. It was an absence of sound, total and immediate, filling every corner of a room that had held 200 people in motion and now held 200 people completely still. I do not have a word for what that silence felt like from the inside. Not triumph, not vindication, something older and quieter. The specific weight of 14 years arriving precisely on time. Patricia was standing 6 feet from where she had grabbed Corporal Reyes's arm. Her hand was still slightly extended toward where his arm had been. Her mouth was slightly open. She was surrounded by the officers, dignitaries, and senior military officials she had expected to back her, and every single one of them was on their feet at attention for the man she had just tried to have arrested. I nodded once to Reyes. Then I turned without looking at Patricia, without hurrying, without raising my voice or offering a single word of explanation, and I walked back into the room. The officers held their position until I had passed. Then, one by one, they sat back down. Conversations resumed. The evening continued. The silence did not continue, but the weight it had deposited in that room did not leave. Some things, once understood, cannot be ununderstood. The dinner after the call to attention was not awkward. It was precise. The precision of a room full of people who had just witnessed something, understood exactly what it meant, and had collectively decided to proceed with the evening without making it into more than it was. Patricia left before the first course was served. Claire did not go after her. That was the the thing I remember most clearly about that moment. Claire staying in her seat, her hand finding mine under the table, her face composed and still. She said nothing. She squeezed my hand once. That was the whole conversation. The officers around me behaved as they always did. Warm, professional, easy. We talked about an upcoming joint exercise, a personnel change in the command structure, a coordination issue that had been sitting unresolved for 6 weeks and might be worth addressing at the next inter-service briefing. Claire sat beside me and participated in the conversation naturally, the way she always does, because she had spent 8 years learning the choreography of my professional world by paying attention to it. On the drive home, I let the quiet sit between us because I knew what it was. It was two people who had just watched something finish. Claire said finally, "I'm sorry it took this long." I looked at the road. I said, "You didn't do anything wrong." She said, "I let it go on." I said, "So did I." She said, "I'm going to talk to her." I said, "I know," and I did know. Not with threat or condition, but with the simple certainty of a man who had watched his wife absorb something for 6 years and had just seen her reach the same clear place he had. The rest of the drive was quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that does not require filling. Commander Diane Walsh, 44 years old, Naval Intelligence, 16 years of service, had been at the ball that night. She had watched the entire thing from her position at the head table. She stopped by my office on base 2 days later, sat down across from my desk, and said, with the directness I had always valued in her, "How are you actually doing?" I laughed, the kind of laugh that surprises you because it's real. She had a way of bypassing the ornamental and arriving at the actual with a single sentence. We talked for an hour, not about the incident, about the pattern beneath it, 6 years of it, the specific particular weight of competence that is unquestioned in professional spaces being systematically dismissed in personal ones by a person whose opinion should not have had the power it did. Diane asked whether Claire understood the full scope of it now. I said, for the first time, yes. She nodded. She did not offer advice, which is one of the things I have always respected about her. She let the conversation be what it needed to be. Two officers who had understood each other's world for 8 years sitting in a closed office, acknowledging that the personal costs of service do not always arrive from the service itself. Sometimes they arrive from the people who were never willing to understand what the service meant. I called my father that week. He was 68, retired from his teaching position, living in the same house in Annapolis where I had grown up. I told him what had happened at the ball. I gave him enough, not everything. He listened in the way he had always listened, the focused stillness of a man who believes that speaking deserves the full weight of his attention. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You never needed anyone to prove it for you, James, but I'm glad the room did it anyway." I sat with that sentence after the call ended and found that it functioned the way his words had always functioned. Not as comfort exactly, but as confirmation. The ground I was standing on was solid. It had always been solid. I had simply been carrying someone else's doubt about it for 6 years, and the weight had been real even when the doubt was not. Claire's conversation with her mother happened on a Thursday evening. I was not present. I did not ask for a detailed account. What Claire told me was this. Her mother's first position was confusion, performed confusion, the kind that operates as a defense rather than an admission. She had been concerned. She hadn't understood the situation. James should have been clearer about who he was. Claire said she had been clear. She had told her mother my rank at every family dinner for 6 years. She had introduced me by title at holiday gatherings. She had explained my role more times than she could count. Patricia said the military was confusing to people who hadn't grown up in it. Claire said, "You've had 6 years, Mom. You didn't try." Patricia's voice shifted to injury, the wounded version of herself she deployed when rational argument failed to hold the room. "After everything I've done for you?" Claire did not move. She said, "What I need from you is simple, not warmth, not approval, basic acknowledgement that James is who he is and that you will stop trying to make him feel small in his own career and his own marriage. That's the whole thing. One standard, minimum decency." Patricia said she had never tried to make anyone feel small. Claire said she understood that Patricia didn't experience it that way. She said the experience of the person on the receiving end was not up for debate. The conversation ended without resolution. It ended with something more important. Patricia understanding, possibly for the first time, that the version of her son-in-law she had decided to believe in no longer had any purchase on the people who actually knew him. Patricia called me directly 10 days later. I was at my desk on base when it came through. She had never once in 6 years initiated a call to me directly. She was composed. Her voice was steady and precise and entirely controlled. She said there had been a misunderstanding at the ball. She said she had been confused. She said if I wanted to be treated differently at family events, I ought to be more forthcoming about my position. She was articulate. She was specific. She was completely, fundamentally wrong in a way that she had practiced so carefully it had become indistinguishable from sincerity. I let her finish without interrupting. When she was done, I said, "I introduced myself by rank every time we met for 6 years, Patricia. I told you my title at every family dinner. I answered your questions about my work directly and in detail every time you asked. You simply made a decision early on about what I was and what I was worth, and you maintained that decision against 6 years of contrary evidence. That is not a communication communication failure. That is a choice, and the consequences of that choice played out in a ballroom in front of 200 people. I ended the call. I set the phone on my desk. I sat with the silence that followed, and the silence felt exactly like what it was. The particular stillness of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying for a long time and has finally decided no longer belongs to him. The months that followed moved in increments that were small individually and substantial in aggregate. Claire's brother, Garrett Weston, called Frank 2 weeks after the ball. He had seen the clip. An officer's spouse had captured the call to attention on a phone, and it had circulated quietly through the joint service family community and through them into the civilian circles that overlap. Garrett had watched it 3 times. He said he owed me an apology. I told him I appreciated it. He said, "I didn't take you seriously. I thought you were, I don't know. I didn't think about it. Mom always talked about you like you were, I don't know what I thought." I said, "You thought what she told you to think." He said, "Yeah." We talked for 40 minutes. It was the first real conversation I had ever had with him. He asked about the Joint Task Force, about intelligence work in general, about what the elevated clearance designation on my card actually meant. I explained. He listened. At the end, he said, "I'm going to say something to Mom." I said, "That's between you and her." He said, "I know. I'm going to do it anyway." Patricia's note arrived on a Monday. Cream-colored monogram stationery, small, controlled handwriting. It did not contain an apology in the full sense. It did not contain the word sorry. It said that she understood she had misread the situation at the ball. It said she had at times allowed concerns for Claire to affect how she treated me. It said she would like to do better going forward. The language was precise. The tone was managed. The handwriting was entirely steady. I showed it to Claire. I said, "This is a start." I meant it as exactly that and nothing more. Not forgiveness, not warmth, a start. A door cracked open just enough to admit light but not yet wide enough to walk through. I was willing to let it be exactly that without pushing it further. In late spring, I received a formal commendation from the Joint Task Force commander for the intelligence coordination framework I had been developing across 8 months. Ceremony in a conference room on base. 30, maybe 40 people. The specific language of military commendation read aloud, acknowledging work that mattered to people who understood what it meant. Claire was there. She stood at the back of the room. Afterward, walking to the car, she took my hand without saying anything. We walked that way for a while. I thought about the fact that this, an ordinary parking lot, afternoon light, Claire's hand in mine, the absence of anything to brace against, was what a normal evening had always been supposed to feel like. I had forgotten the specific texture of it, not because it was unfamiliar, but because the constant low-level vigilance of managing Patricia's presence in our life had obscured it for long enough that I had stopped knowing I was missing it. Now I remembered, and the remembering was clean. By August, 4 months after the ball, I had stopped counting the time since it. That is the marker. Not when you decide something is over, but when you realize you've stopped tracking it. The ball had clarified something I had been uncertain about for 6 years. Not about my rank, not about Patricia, not even entirely about Claire. About what I was willing to carry and what I was not. What was left after I put the rest down was lighter than I had expected. Quieter, significantly better. Patricia attended a family dinner at Garrett's house in September. She and I occupied the same room for 3 hours. She spoke to me twice, once to ask in general terms about my work, and once to say the chicken was well seasoned, which was directed at the table but landed in my direction. Neither exchange contained a cut, neither was warm. Both were civil. I accepted them for what they were. The careful, measured interactions of 2 people who would not be close, but who had agreed, without ceremony, to stop being at war. On the drive home, I noticed I had not spent any part of the evening bracing for something. The absence of that feeling was so notable it registered as physical. A looseness in my shoulders, a space in my chest, the specific relief of setting down something heavy that you have been carrying long enough to forget that it has weight. Claire drove. I watched the road go by. She said, "You seem lighter." I said, "I am." She said, "Good." That was the whole thing. A letter arrived from Corporal Daniel Reyes on a Tuesday in October. He had been reassigned to a new post and wrote before he left. Single paragraph, his unit stationery, handwritten. He said the evening of the ball was something he would carry from his time in service. He did not explain what it had meant to him or what he had felt in the moment. He simply said he was glad to have been doing his job correctly when it mattered. I read it twice. I filed it in the same drawer where I keep my father's letter from the day I pinned on Captain's bars. 2 pieces of paper from 2 different men, separated by years, connected by the same thing. Do the work right. Everything else follows. On an early morning in October, before the base had fully woken up, I sat alone at the kitchen table in the particular quiet of a Navy town at dawn. The streetlights still on, the sky pale at the edges, the shift change not yet happened. I sat with my coffee and looked at my dress whites hanging by the door, the uniform from the ball. 14 years of service on its shoulders. It hung the way it always hung, pressed, ready, waiting, not requiring anything from me, not asking to be admired or explained or defended, simply hanging there the way something earned hangs, quietly, without performance, with the complete patience of a thing that knows what it is. I did not look at it with pride exactly. I looked at it with recognition definition. This is who you are. You do not have to prove it. You do not have to announce it. You do not have to wait for someone to finally learn your rank. You simply have to keep showing up. I finished my coffee. I thought about the day ahead, a briefing to prepare, a call with a counterpart in the Pacific, the ordinary and significant architecture of work that matters. I thought about Patricia briefly and found the thought passed clean through without catching on anything. Not because I had forgiven her in any grand theatrical sense, but because the space she had occupied in my mind, the readiness, the low-level vigilance, the constant preparation for the next small damage had been vacated, and what moved in to fill it was simply the rest of my life. That is the whole thing. The best outcome of that evening at the ball was not the moment every officer in the room stood up. It was the morning 6 months later when I realized I had stopped thinking about it because it was simply done, finished, completed, not with a bang, but with an early morning kitchen and a cup of coffee, and a man looking at his uniform in the first light of a new day, and knowing, without needing anyone to confirm it, that he had always been exactly who he was. I was simply living. That is enough. That has always been enough.